Welcome to this evening's Royal Historical Society lecture. I'm Lucy Noakes, I'm the current president of the Society, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this, the second in this year's series of Royal Historical Society public lectures on this lovely warm London evening. So tonight it really is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Stoyle as our speaker. Those of you who don't know Mark, he is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Southampton, and he's a specialist in histories of religion, society, and popular culture in the English Southwest. So it's also for us an opportunity to welcome Mark back to the Royal Historical Society as he served as a member of council. Mark's historical interests were sparked as a school pupil in rural Devon, where he first learned of that county's substantial and turbulent response to religious change in the mid-16th century, and which culminated, as I'm sure many of you know, in the acts of resistance that are known today as the Prayer Book Rebellion. And Mark's research on this subject culminated in his absolutely fantastic 2022 book, Murderous Midsummer, The Western Rising of 1549, which I really enjoyed reading. That's great, well, thank you, which was published by Yale University Press. And more recently, Mark's research has focused on the legacies of the English Civil Wars as a co-investigator on a really interesting sounding project studying conflict, welfare and memory, maimed soldiers and war widows of the English Civil Wars, 1642 until 1700. But this evening, Mark is combining his work on 16th century religious rebellion with his current focus on memory in 17th century England. And in tonight's lecture, he will consider how those in Devon and Cornwall looked back on the upheavals of the 1540s and 1550s and the legacy of these events for later generations. So please now join me in welcoming Mark to give his lecture, Remembering Rebellion in the Tudor Southwest.
Oh, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this lovely evening when I'm sure lots of people would be tempted to stay at home in the garden. And thank you, Lucy, for those very kind words of introduction. I feel extremely honoured to have been invited to address the Society tonight and to have been given this opportunity to speak to you all about a subject which has lain close to my heart ever since, as Lucy says, I was a teenager, that of popular protest in 16th century England. So, as a reassuringly large number of school children continue to know, a series of major rebellions against the policies of the central government took place in this country between the accession of Henry VII in 1485 and the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. And these periodic insurgencies have attracted the attention of some of the greatest scholars of the Tudor age. Dermot McCulloch, Krista Kesselring, John Walter and Andy Wood, to name only the most prominent figures in the field, have all produced immensely stimulating books and articles which deal either in whole or in part with the popular disturbances of the 16th century. And the textbook, which gave those perturbations the collective name by which they've become familiar to generations of history students, Anthony Fletcher's Tudor Rebellions, originally published in 1968 and from 1996 onwards regularly revised by Dermot McCulloch, that book is still going strong more than 50 years after it first appeared. And the bibliography which accompanies the latest edition of that book illustrates just how rich and varied the seam of historical writing on the insurrections of the Tudor period has by now become. So intense has scholarly scrutiny of these episodes been indeed that it would be easy to assume that there's little left of interest to say about them. But while we now have a much more detailed understanding of the causes of the individual protests and of precisely what transpired while they were underway, we still know far less than we would like about how they were regarded in retrospect by the English and indeed the Cornish people. And in my lecture tonight, I'm going to delve into the shadowy afterlives of the Tudor rebellions, and more specifically, I'm going to consider some of the different ways in which memories of these dramatic events continued to ricochet through the popular imagination long after the insurrections themselves had come to an end. Now, over the past 3 decades, as I'm sure all of you know, scholars in a wide range of disciplines have become increasingly fascinated by the processes of memorialisation and by the tangled interconnections which exist between history and memory. And work on the First World War in particular has been really important. Fussell's work, Lucy's work, many other really brilliant scholars working on the First World War memory of that conflict. I think also on the history of the American Civil War, there's been some brilliant writing on that, Ghosts of the Confederacy, wonderful book. This sort of interest is moving into lots of other fields as well. So I myself am currently engaged with 4 friends and fellow historians, as Lucy has said, on a major project exploring the memory of the English Civil Wars. And my friend Lloyd Bowen and I recently co-edited a collection of essays on that subject. And our book now forms just one small part of what has become a burgeoning scholarly literature on the memorialisation of the mid-17th century conflict. A sort of a literature which I think is probably paralleled or perhaps even bettered by a similar efflorescence of academic writing on the memorialisation of the English Reformation. And Alex Walsham has been particularly sort of central in writing on that theme. Yet, while many historians have touched in passing upon some of the specific ways in which the risings of the Tudor period were viewed in retrospect, only a handful of writers have devoted sustained attention to the mental and cultural legacies of these episodes. And I think I'd name most notably here perhaps Andy Wood, Amanda Jones, John Walter and Nicola White. And their work, like that of most of the other scholars who've provided us with more sort of fleeting insights into the afterlives of the Tudor rebellions, has been chiefly focused on the protests which took place here in the southeast of England and in the Midlands. And in my lecture tonight, I'm going to seek to build upon the work of those who've laboured in this particular vineyard before me by asking what the scattered fragments of evidence we still possess can tell us about memories of rebellion in the far southwest, a region of the country which has so far been but little discussed in connection with this subject. And as this first slide shows, my lecture tonight is going to be divided into 3 parts. In the first, I'm going to provide a thumbnail sketch of each of the rebellions which took place in the Tudor Southwest before moving on to consider how some of those episodes went on to be officially, or at least semi-officially, memorialised. In the second, I'm going to consider some of the ways in which local gentry look back on the rebellions during the Tudor and early Stuart periods. And in the third and last part, I will turn to ask how those below the level of the gentry look back on those same rebellions during that same period. Now, this is a question which it's especially difficult to answer, of course, but also one that is of especially absorbing interest. So that's my prospectus for the next 50 minutes or so. And let me begin by swiftly introducing the individual revolts themselves, just in case anybody here tonight may have temporarily forgotten their precise chronology. So a total of 5 more or less serious insurrections occurred in the Tudor West Country. And the first of them began at St Kevin in the far west of Cornwall, a particularly beautiful region, as Philip and I were discussing earlier. And this happened in May 1497, when local people were stirred to anger by what they saw as Henry VII's excessive financial demands. The Cornish protesters marched eastwards, picking up many supporters in the south of England as they went, and they eventually got as far as Blackheath, just a few miles from London. Here they were defeated in a bloody battle fought with the King's army on the 17th of June. Now, the second Southwestern Rebellion broke out just 3 months later, again in West Cornwall, when the Yorkist pretender, Perkin Warbeck, disembarked near the Land's End and was proclaimed as Richard IV by his local partisans. Warbeck raised several thousand men, advanced into Devon and laid siege to Exeter, the regional capital. Yet he failed to capture the city, and once news had arrived that Henry VII was hurrying westward with a powerful army, Warbeck's nerve failed him and his insurgency collapsed. The third revolt, remarkably enough, broke out in exactly the same place as the first. In 1548, the inhabitants of St Kevin and the nearby parishes rose up in arms against the Protestantising religious reforms of the boy king Edward VI. The insurgents converged on the town of Helston, where they killed an unpopular government agent named William Body. And in the wake of Body's death, the protesters' numbers grew to some 3,000 men, but they were persuaded to disperse by local gentlemen a few days later. The fourth rebellion, and the most formidable of them all, took place during the summer of 1549, when the people of Devon and Cornwall rose up en masse against the ongoing religious changes and once again laid siege to Exeter. Edward's ministers were forced to assemble a substantial army to deal with what they clearly regarded as an existential threat, and the protesters were only defeated after a series of pitched battles which left as many as 4,000 people dead. And when you consider how much smaller the population of the region was then than it is today, that's a huge figure. The fifth and last rebellion, by contrast, was something of a damp squib. In 1554, the evangelical Devon gentleman, Sir Peter Carew, together with a knot of local supporters, attempted to stir the county's inhabitants into joining a projected national revolt against the forthcoming marriage of the Catholic Queen Mary to Philip II of Spain. Carew's appeals fell on largely deaf ears, however, and within days he had fled abroad, leaving the handful of men who had joined him to be quickly rounded up by the authorities. All five of these revolts failed then, and all five of them were suppressed within days, weeks, or at most months of their commencement. Yet this does not mean that they should be regarded as insignificant or inconsequential. On the contrary, they were amongst the most momentous things to happen in the southwest between the Black Death and the English Civil War. And the rising of 1549 in particular has been well described as a cataclysmic event in the region's history. It's no surprise to find that memories of the revolts continued to suffuse West Country society throughout the early modern period, therefore. And as I will now go on to show, such memories were sometimes deliberately fostered through both official and semi-official acts of commemoration. Now, at first sight, it may seem strange to you all that anyone in a position of authority during the Tudor period should have wished to commemorate rebellions at all. Such episodes were embarrassing reminders of the fact that subjects were not always obedient to their rulers after all, and that they could sometimes rise up against them, a fact which rulers themselves would obviously not wish to acknowledge. It may well have been partly for this reason, indeed, that Henry VII brusquely dismissed the suggestion of one of his courtiers that a formal triumph should be held to commemorate his defeat of the rebels at Blackheath, saying that he had not gained a worthy victory, having been against such a base crew as those Cornishmen. And if monarchs could see little advantage to themselves in perpetuating the memory of rebellions, however, provincial town governors occasionally could. And it's interesting to note that although Henry VII had pointedly refused to mark his defeat of the Cornish rebels in June 1497, a few months later, the king himself began a tradition which would for centuries to come commemorate his defeat of the second rebel force, which had risen in support of Warbeck later that same year. In 1599, the Chamberlain of Exeter, John Hooker, also a noted antiquary and a man whose writings I will return to on several occasions tonight, noted that a ceremonial sword had been carried in civic processions in his hometown for 100 years or above, the tradition having been started by the gift of King Henry VII, who, being in this city for the appeasing of the rebellion of Perkin Warbeck, and seeing the mayor to have no sword, did ungird himself of his own sword by his side, which he then did wear, and delivered the same to the mayor to be carried before him. And thereafter, Hooker continued, the sword had always been borne before Exeter's mayors when they processed through the city in state, ensuring that whenever such processions occurred, the inhabitants would be reminded of the events of 1497. And it's worth noting, incidentally, that Henry VII's sword, the Sword of State, to give its official title, is still carried in civic processions in Exeter to this very day, one way in which the rebellions of the Tudor period continue to be commemorated in 21st century local society. So why should the town governors of Exeter have been so keen to incorporate this sword into their civic rituals and to continue doing so long after Henry VII himself was dead? The answer, I think, is obvious. By instituting a commemorative practice which regularly summoned up the ghosts of Warbeck's rebellion, a rebellion which they themselves had helped to defeat, Exeter's civic elite were underlining their own loyalty and thus their status as true subjects who deserved to enjoy special royal favour in the future. And precisely similar calculations surely help to explain why they later decided to institute a second and much more elaborative commemorative practice, this time to underline the role which Exeter had played in resisting the Western rebels in 1549. During the reign of Elizabeth I, the town masters, as the city councillors were colloquially known, decreed that an annual day of thanksgiving, one which would become popularly known as Jesus Day, should be held at Exeter every 6th of August in order to mark the anniversary of the city's relief by the Royal Army in 1549 and the breaking of the rebel siege. Once again, they were drawing the world's attention to the part which Exeter had played in resisting rebellion and to their own exemplary loyalty to the crown. And accordingly, every 6th of August, from at least the late Elizabethan period onwards, the mayor and his fellows marched in solemn state in a procession like this, with Henry VII's sword borne before them, where they attended a special service and listened to a sermon on the evils of rebellion. And they're just being shown here processing from the Guildhall to Exeter Cathedral, which would lie about here if the picture was extended. The choice of a sermon to mark the occasion was particularly apposite because it served to underline the point that the city's resistance had been an act of piety as well as an act of loyalty, that in addition to fighting for the crown against treacherous rebels, the citizens had been fighting for the true Protestant faith against the popish supporters of the Roman Catholic Church. And indeed, one of the considerations which had prompted the town governors to inaugurate these Jesus Day festivities in the first place may well have been their recognition of the fact that by inserting an avowedly Protestant celebration into the city's festive calendar at this particular point in the year, 6th of August, they would be striking yet another blow at the lingering cult of Exeter's native saint, St. Sidwell, whose body had once lain in the church named after her outside the city's east gate, and whose martyrdom and feast day had customarily been celebrated at Exeter on the 1st of August, just a few days before. Now, it's important for me to stress that Exeter's town masters were by no means alone amongst Tudor urban oligarchs in seeking to memorialise their opposition to insurrectionary forces. Like the southwest, East Anglia was convulsed by huge popular demonstrations during the crisis year of 1549, when thousands of country folk rose up in arms under the leadership of the Wymondham yeoman, Robert Kett, to demand redress of a host of social and economic grievances. Now, the town governors of Norwich initially tried to resist the insurgents, but unlike their counterparts in Exeter, they were quickly overwhelmed. Norwich was then occupied by Kett's followers for almost a month until they were at length driven out by a royal army under the command of John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, on the 24th of August. 3 days later, Dudley's forces cut the protesters to ribbons in a battle fought nearby. Now, the mayor and common councillors of Norwich, no doubt anxious to underline their abhorrence of the rebels, lest the city's swift capitulation in 1549 should be thought to betoken any hint of disloyalty on their part, subsequently decreed that 27th of August, the day of our deliverance, as they put it, should be set aside as an annual day of thanksgiving forever. And from 1550 onwards, the 27th of August was solemnised in the city as a day of prayer, and in Norwich, just as in Exeter, a special sermon was preached in the cathedral. And both of these commemorations subsequently proved remarkably enduring. In Norwich, the annual Thanksgiving services for the defeat of Kett's rebels were still being held in the 1660s, while Jesus Day was still being celebrated in Exeter as late as 1835. That's as late as I've been able to trace it. It may have gone even a bit later. Now, the days of Thanksgiving, which were instituted at Exeter and Norwich, are comparatively well known. But these aren't the only places in which provincial town governors exploited the memory of 1549 to their own advantage. As Andy Wood has shown, in 1594, the town authorities of Yarmouth in Norfolk petitioned Elizabeth I to assist them in rebuilding their harbour, and justified this request by claiming that it had originally been destroyed by Kett with his rebels in 1549 as an act of revenge for the inhabitants' refusal to admit them to the town. And I recently discovered that a similar case survives from the southwest, because in 1595, Elizabeth granted a new charter to the little Cornish town of Market Jew, which, as some of you will know, stands on the coast just opposite the great fortress of St Michael's Mount. Now, the text of this charter declared that Market Jew had formerly been a place of great repute, but that this happy situation had been transformed during the reign of Edward VI, when a multitude of rebels entered and possessed it, and the same was by them destroyed and laid waste. The Queen had been informed of this sad history by many of her subjects, the charter went on, and had therefore decided to incorporate the town in order to restore its fortunes. We need hardly doubt that the leading inhabitants of Market Jew had been prominent amongst those who had made sure that Elizabeth was informed of the town's tribulations during the Western Rising, nor that, like the town governors of Yarmouth, they had added a good deal of spin to their representations. Now, that some damage had been inflicted on Market Jew during the fighting which had occurred when the protesters besieged the loyalist forces who had taken refuge in the Mount in July 1549 does seem quite probable. But that the entire town had been laid waste at this time, as the charter suggests, is hard to credit. And the Market Jew Charter reminds us that, as well as being officially memorialised through days of Thanksgiving and through the deployment of physical objects like Henry VII's sword, the popular protests of the Tudor period were also semi-officially memorialised through the written word. Charters would have had a relatively small and localised readership, of course, but the many historical chronicles which were published at this time, most of them featuring brief accounts of the main Tudor rebellions, reached out to a much wider audience. Thus, in 1575, Alexander Neville published a narrative account in Latin of the protests in Norfolk in 1549, which was itself based on an earlier manuscript account of those protests written by Nicholas Southerton, who is a member of a prominent Norwich family. And this is the front page of Neville's work. Southerton's original manuscript was designed partly to minimise the rather ambiguous interactions which had occurred between the town governors and the demonstrators at the height of the protests, and partly to warn the local gentry against ever allowing such a rebellion to happen again. 40 years later, the book was translated into English by Richard Wood, and it was reprinted, thus transmitting its messages to readers well beyond Neville's original, quite restricted target audience. And as Dermot McCulloch and Andy Wood have shown, Neville's account gradually came to be accepted as the authorised narrative of the East Anglian protests. And this in turn meant that it eventually came to determine more or less exclusively how those protests would be viewed by subsequent generations of readers and those who listened to them reading these stories out. And this pattern of an individual rebellion increasingly coming to be seen in retrospect through the prism of a single master narrative is also very apparent in the case of the Western Rising. And here it was John Hooker who emerged as the key chronicler of the protests. During the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, Hooker, who as a young man had actually helped to defend Exeter against the insurgents, had written a document entitled The Description of the City of Exeter, which survives in several different versions, all of which incorporate accounts of the siege of 1549. And he had then gone on to compose a detailed narrative of the Western Rising as a whole. The final version of this text was published in 1587 in the second edition of Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, of which Hooker was one of the co-editors. This volume, as I'm sure loads of you will know, went on to be enormously influential and widely read. And this in its turn helped to ensure that Hooker's account would become the authorised narrative of the Western Rising, just as Neville's account became the authorised narrative of Kett's rebellion. Hooker's narrative, just like Neville's, was designed to warn future generations against the evils of rebellion. But it also sought first, as well, even more important from Hooker's point of view, to underline the evils of Catholicism, which he saw as the Rising's primary motivating force. And second, like the earlier, shorter works from which it had sprung, this major narrative was designed to celebrate the fortitude with which Exeter had held out against the insurgents. So Hooker's narrative was above all an expression of civic pride then, and he surely intended it to reinforce the message which was already being proclaimed to the world at large through the Jesus Day celebrations and through the regular parading of Henry VII's sword, that Exeter was a preternaturally loyal city. It does not seem to be going too far indeed to suggest that Hooker did more than anyone else in the city's long history to advance and strengthen this particular claim of Exeter as an amazingly loyal place. In several of his early works, Hooker implied that the citizens of Exeter had been faithful to constituted authority since the time of the Roman conquest. And it is clear that the town governors specifically cited this remarkable claim when they sought to obtain ratification and augmentation of their civic coat of arms from the Queen in 1564. Excuse me, a request which was duly granted. Now, as I hope to show in detail elsewhere, the subsequent decision of the town masters to adopt as their civic motto the ringing phrase Semper Fidelis, that's to say, ever faithful, itself seems to have been inspired by the narrative of unbending loyalty to the crown which Hooker had constructed, a narrative which he had almost certainly been inspired to create in the first place by his own vivid memories of the siege of 1549. This next slide shows Exeter's coat of arms and motto, Semper Fidelis, in their final mid-17th century iteration. The iteration in which they continue to be displayed throughout the city to this present day. There are literally dozens of examples of this all over the place. And I'm sure that none of you here would be in the least bit surprised to learn that I have a representation of that coat of arms and motto tattooed here above my heart, together with a tattoo of St. Sidwell on my right arm. Now, fortunately, I've so far managed to resist the temptation, but one day, who knows? So, Exeter's civic motto is yet another permanent reminder of the temptation, of the rebellions rather, which occurred in Devon and Cornwall during the Tudor period, and of the assiduousness with which the town masters sought to memorialise their assistance to those past insurrections. So, having glanced at some of the ways in which the rebellions which took place in the Tudor southwest were officially commemorated, I'd now like to consider some of the ways in which those events were recalled by individual local gentlemen. Now, throughout the early modern period, of course, rebellions were depicted by those in authority as both violent and socially disruptive, and gentlefolk were therefore conditioned to remember them with a mental shudder, as episodes which had temporarily threatened their own wealth and power. Several fragments of evidence suggest that in the West Country, just as elsewhere, gentlemen never forgot where rebellions had broken out in the past and worried that those places might well become centres of rebellion again in the future. When the Cornish knight, Sir William Godolphin, heard rumours that a protest against Henry VIII's religious policies was being planned at St. Kevin, of all places, in 1537, for example, he hastened to remind the King's Chief Minister, Thomas Cromwell, that the people of St. Kevin had been the first that stirred the Cornishmen to rise when they came to Blackheath in 1497. And for good measure, Godolphin went on to recall that one of the main leaders of that rising, the blacksmith, Michael Joseph, had also dwelt here in St. Kevin. Godolphin hunted down the men who had been planning the protest, and perhaps as a result, St. Kevin remained quiet throughout the rest of the 1530s. But as we've seen, a second revolt erupted there in 1548, thus confirming the local gentry in their belief that St. Kevin was an intrinsically seditious place. It's interesting to note that when a local gentleman named John Tregose petitioned Elizabeth I for help against a group of St. Kevin men in 1583, he was careful to remind the monarch that this was the place wherein the late insurrection in Cornwall, made in the reign of your Majesty's brother, had its commencement. And here, of course, Tregose was attempting to blacken his enemies' names simply by stressing that they lived in a notoriously rebellious parish. It's worth pointing out, moreover, that in the wake of the Western Rising, the protest which had broken out in St. Kevin the year before came to be widely regarded as the precursor of the second, far more serious revolt, a perception which can only have caused the local gentry to eye this parish more nervously still. And this tendency to remember St. Kevin as the fons et origo of rebellion in 1549, as well as in 1548, is nicely illustrated by the words of the gentleman antiquary Richard Carew, who observed in his famous Survey of Cornwall, published in 1603, that the last Cornish rebellion was first occasioned by the inhabitants of St. Kevin, who imbrued their wicked hands in the blood of one Mr. Body as he sat in commission at Helston for matters of reformation in religion, and the year following this grew to a general revolt. So Carew himself was born in 1555, just 6 years after the Western Rising. His survey was partly informed by the memories of his social circle, therefore, and the book provides a number of valuable insights into the way in which Carew, and presumably other members of the gentry class too, looked back on the rebellions of the recent past. At one point, Carew supplies his readers in this book with a potted history of Cornwall, a history which ends with 3 paragraphs discussing the rebellions of 1497 to 1549. Now, it's tempting to deduce from this that Carew may have regarded those revolts as the last truly significant events to have taken place in his native shire. He devotes a long paragraph to the first rebellion of 1497 and a second, much shorter one to the rising of war in support of Warbeck later that year, indicating that he viewed the former protest as the more important of the two. And as I've just said, he also conflates the risings of 1548 and 1549 within a single paragraph and makes it clear that he saw the two as intimately connected. Carew's reference to 1497 as that fatal year of revolts hints that he regarded the risings against Henry VII with particular regret, perhaps because it was these episodes which had first led to Cornwall becoming saddled with what Carew and his gentry neighbours would surely have regarded as a most unwelcome reputation for rebelliousness. It's worth noting too that throughout his text, Carew lumps together all of those who had taken part in the various protests, referring to them collectively as rebels and rakehells or rascal, and making little distinction between the various groups, even though the grievances which had underlain these 4 risings had by no means been entirely the same. The scattered allusions which Carew makes to the way in which the rebels of 1548-9 had treated the local gentry, allusions which were surely based, at least in part, on what he'd been told by those who had personal memories of the 1540s, are, I think, particularly interesting. As we've seen, Carew includes just one short paragraph on the risings of 1548-9 in his potted history of Cornwall. But he is careful to highlight within this the fact that the rebels of 1548 had murdered one Mr. Body at Helston. The title Mr. here pointedly underlining Body's gentry status. And elsewhere, moreover, Carew provides several vivid accounts of how gentlemen and women had been captured, roughly handled, and robbed by the protesters in 1549, and twice asserts that the terrified captives had been lucky to escape with their lives. Now, there can be little doubt that Carew's inclusion of these anecdotes reflects his genuine conviction, partly based on the testimony of his elite informants, that the rebels of 1548-9 had been driven by fierce class animus. Yet at the same time, his decision to highlight the few occasions on which members of the local elite are known to have defied the protesters was surely intended, at least in part, to sidestep uneasy memories of the fact that most Cornish gentlemen had either sat on their hands or fled in 1549, while a number of them, notoriously, had actually acted as the rebels' leaders. It's worth noting too that William Body is the only gentleman who is known to have been murdered by the Cornish rebels in either 1548 or 1549, so his case is completely atypical, though one would not guess this from reading Carew's texts. And finally, of course, we should note that Carew had a deductive motive for including these particular stories within his survey. By laying stress on the hardship which some gentlefolk had undergone at rebel hands, Carew was pointing up the message of just how terrible rebellion was for his intended gentry readers, just as Neville and Hooker had done before him. And throughout the late Elizabethan and early Stuart periods, you won't be surprised to hear that local gentlemen would continue to write about these revolts in very similar terms. During the 1590s, for example, a much less well-known figure, the Devon gentleman Robert Furze, made several allusions to the Western Rising in the manuscript history of his family, which he wrote for the benefit of his descendants and which has recently been published. And once again, Furze specifically mentioned both the place in which that rebellion had begun and the fact that local gentlemen had been held captive by the protesters. Looking back on the life of Philip Furze, a gentleman who had lived at Thorburton in Devon, I can't resist saying the village in which I grew up, Robert recalled that Philip Furze had been, by the rebels, long a prisoner at Sampford, and very evil entreated and in great hazard. Now, this comment is revealing in several respects. We may note, first of all, that this was the first time that Furze had referred to the Western Rising in his text. So, his casual allusion to the rebels therefore implies that he expected his readers to know at once to which particular group of insurgents he was referring, further evidence of how far that revolt had remained alive in local memory at the time that he was writing. And Robert's observation that Philip had been held prisoner at Sampford is more interesting still, for the Western Rising had actually begun in the mid-Devon village of Sampford Courtenay, which you see here, and an inhabitant of that parish, a man named William Underhill, had emerged as one of the chief rebel captains. And the rebellion actually began outside this church with a confrontation in the graveyard. I can't resist saying this is a beautiful church and a beautiful village. If you're ever in the district, do pop in and visit it. The echoes of the Tudor rebellions, I think, are still quite close to the surface here. It's a really lovely place to go to. But anyway, the fact that Furze simply referred to Sampford in his text therefore demonstrates not only that the initial seat of the 1549 rebellion was firmly marked on his mental map, but also that he expected it to be firmly marked on that of his descendants as well. And it's almost superfluous to add that Furze's recollection of his ancestor Philip being ill-treated and put in fear of his life by his rebel captors neatly accords with Carew's recollections concerning the treatment of the Cornish gentry. And those recollections are also echoed in the memories which Elizabeth Courtenay, the widow of the Devon knight Sir Piers, long preserved at the time that her husband had been taken prisoner and extreme peril to be cruelly handled by the rebels in the Western Commotion. And this is one of the few fragments of sort of female memories of the Tudor rebellions that I've been able to dredge up. I found a few more since, and I'd like to write a little piece on that specific subject because there are some interesting memories of women who were swept up in this, but they're very few and far between. It's hard enough to track down male memories of the commotion, even harder to find female ones, but Elizabeth Courtenay's memories are one good example. So Robert's account of Philip Ferrers's ordeal provides a further example of local gentlefolk remembering the Western Rising in what we might call the authorised manner, as a traumatic episode during which they themselves had been ill-treated by the protesters. But another one of Robert Ferrers's anecdotes shows his family remembering the Rising in a very different way, as a traumatic episode during which they themselves had been ill-treated by the supporters of the Crown. Writing of another forebear, John Ferrers, Robert recalled that he had been greatly spoiled in the commotion in King Edward VI's time, for he was then given body and goods like a rebel, and yet during all of the time of that rebellion, he was continually in his bed sick and not able to travel. What Robert was alluding to here was the fact that in the wake of the Rising, John had himself been accused of being a rebel by the king's commanders. He had therefore been forced to pay a ransom in order to release both his person and his goods from the clutches of the unnamed loyalist into whose hands he had been given as a supposed rebel. Robert Ferrers went on to recall that his ancestor John had been forced to lay out the enormous sum of £140 in order to clear himself of this trouble, and he was clearly highly indignant on his forebear's behalf, who he asserts, far from being a rebel, had in fact lain sick in bed throughout the whole course of the Rising. Now, we'll never be able to determine the truth of this claim, of course, but what Ferrers's anecdote makes crystal clear is that some local gentry families long preserve vivid memories of their relatives being accused of complicity in the 1549 Rising and punished for it afterwards, a fact which underscores the point that in private, elite recollections of that Rising did not always accord with the official narrative, which preferred to present rebellions as a straightforward contest between loyal gentlemen and disloyal commoners. And a classic example, I think, of the way in which memories of the Western Rising were later forced into this official template by a local gentry writer, rather as the ugly sisters tried to force their feet into Cinderella's shoe, comes from Tristram Risdon's Survey of Devon, written in the early 1600s. Born in North Devon in 1580, Risdon composed this work in such a way as to conduct its readers on a virtual tour of Devon, in the process providing brief accounts of every parish in the Shire. And tellingly, when he arrived at Sandford Courtenay in this sort of virtual peregrination, he adjured his gentry readers that this place is to be remembered for the insurrection begun here on the 10th of June 1549. So again, Sandford as the centre of this rebellion. And here again, we can see how the seats of rebellion past continue to cast a very long shadow in elite memory. And Risdon then proceeded to give a brief and altogether misleading account of the Rising itself, claiming that it had been started by two of the inhabitants of this parish. The one would have no gentlemen, the other would have no justices of the peace, intending indeed to destroy all such as were rich or in authority. Whereupon one William Hellions, gentleman, persuading them to be obedient to the laws, was by them cut in pieces. Now, as I've shown elsewhere, far from being based on genuine memories of what had happened at Sandford Courtenay in 1549, this passage is simply a mashup of two brief extracts which had appeared in previous printed accounts of the Rising. One of them written by the Protestant martyrologist John Fox, and the other, as Jonathan McGovern has very recently demonstrated, almost certainly written by Sir Peter Carew, the Devon gentleman who had been the protesters' most bitter local antagonist. And as you can see here, was quite a formidable figure. Obviously, Carew and Fox both sort of predestined to present the rebels in the most unpleasant way. And it's fascinating to note how Risdon smoothly imports extracts from these two highly tendentious works into his text in order to present the rebellion as a class rising against the gentry, rather than as the religious rising, which almost all of the contemporary sources agree that it was. And it's fascinating too to note how, just like Richard Carew before him, Risdon places the wholly atypical murder of a single supposed gentleman, in this case William Hellions, at the heart of his account of the Western Rising, in order to give the impression that the insurgents were blood-crazed class warriors. Altogether more helpful, I think, in our quest for genuine elite memories are the writings of yet another gentleman antiquary, Thomas Westcott, who during the 1620s completed the manuscript text which long after his death would be printed under the title of A View of Devonshire in the year 1630. Westcott was born in Mid-Devon in 1567. He was 13 years older than Risdon then, and he grew up at a time when memories of the rebellion of 1549 must still have been relatively fresh. Westcott included several references to the Western Rising in his lengthy pen portrait of Devon, and like Hooker, Carew and Risdon before him, he made his own distaste for the protesters crystal clear. Westcott twice compared the insurgency to a viper. For example, he noted that the town records of Plymouth had been destroyed by the rebels during the late, and I hope the last, commotion, and he brought his account of a key battle between the protesters and the royal forces to an end with the sententious observation that at length the worst cause had the worst success and the rebels were put to the rout. In a general sense then, Westcott's retrospective account of the Rising, one which was clearly based in part on oral testimonies which he had heard himself, as well as on printed sources, may be said to adhere to the authorised script, stressing as it does that the rebels had been dangerous and destructive and that they had deserved to be defeated. But, intriguingly enough, in a postscript to his text, Westcott goes out of his way to defend himself against several objections which he feared that some of his gentry readers might raise about his treatment of the 1549 rebellion. And, assuming the voice of one of these putative critics in an imagined dialogue with himself as the View's author, Westcott puts the following words into his interlocutor's mouth. "You might have forborne, since your intent was to glorify and ennoble your county and native soil, to have spoken so often in your book of the commotion, which though you palliated it under this word commotion, was in fact a plain rebellion." And here we see Westcott ventriloquising several opinions which were widespread amongst the early modern gentry. First, that memories of rebellion were so dangerous that they shouldn't be stirred up at all. Secondly, that simply to mention the fact that a rebellion had taken place in a particular county was to sully its reputation. And third, that the wickedness of past rebellions should not be glossed over by giving them vague and circumambulatory titles like the commotion. As Daniel Wolfe has observed, most early modern antiquaries did indeed perform the function of unofficial censors by leaving such unpleasantries as rebellion out of their accounts of local affairs. So Westcott was surely right to suspect that by discussing the Rising in his text, and therefore failing fully to implement the filtration process which elite custom required, he was running the risk of offending his peers. But, unabashed, Westcott went on to defend himself. First, he observes that if he is to paint a true portrait of his native county, then he must not conceal his blemishes. For, he says, who can draw the counterfeit of Venus and not paint the mole upon her chin? And secondly, he justifies his decision to term the Rising the commotion on the grounds of common usage, pointing out that it is remembered to this day by the name of the commotion, and old men reckon their age from it. A fascinating remark in itself. And finally, Westcott denies that his allusions to the Rising are in any way damaging to his own county's reputation. For, so he claims, Devon folk have little to reproach themselves with in respect of the rebellion of 1549. That viper, he claims, was not hatched here in this county, but in Cornwall, though somewhat nourished and increased as it crept through this county, with a few of the poorer and baser sort, not a man of worth or name joining them, and in fine, the head of that viper was crushed chiefly by those of this county. And Westcott's claim that the Western Rising had begun in Cornwall rather than in Devon is interesting and was probably based on Carew's earlier portrayal of the 1548 revolt at St. Kevin as the prelude to the much more serious rebellion which had broken out in the following year. But it's important to stress that it was a false claim, one which was designed to salve Devon's honour in the eyes of its gentry governors by minimising its involvement in the rebellion, as were Westcott's assertions that few of the county's ordinary inhabitants had joined the rebels and that not a single Devon gentleman had done so. And here, Westcott may be said to have returned to the authorised script, brushing over the truth of what had really happened in 1549 in order to portray the Rising as a contest between harebrained and predominantly Cornish commoners and a royal army made up chiefly of Devonian gentlemen and their loyal and devoted retainers. So, I've touched a little bit now on this subject, and I think it's time for me to turn at last, in the final part of my talk, to the memories of the common folk themselves. So how did the ordinary inhabitants of the southwest, those below the level of the gentry, how did they look back upon the rebellions of the Tudor period? Now, that they did remember those episodes, it's impossible to doubt. As we've seen, Westcott stated that some local men calculated their own birthdays against the temporal marker of rebellion past, and this was clearly no more than the literal truth. In 1583, for example, a very elderly man called Thomas Tozer of St. Melian in Cornwall, who had been called to give evidence about the boundaries of a local estate, began his testimony by declaring that he believed himself to be in his 80s. For, as he remembereth, his father and mother did say unto him that he was born about Christmas was 12month after Blackheath Field. And a cluster of depositions made by a group of West Devon folk in 1580 shows them calculating the nativity of another child from the date of a particular rebellion, and this time the Western Rising, in precisely the same sort of way. Thus, a young woman named Philippa Beer of Marystow deposed that she had got married about midsummer after the commotion, when she was in her teens. Her mother then came up to confirm this, recalling that her daughter was likely to be a mother almost as soon as she was a wife, and this was 12 months after the commotion. When 3 deponents were asked how old they believed Philippa's son to be, 2 of them replied that he had certainly been born after the commotion, and the third, more precisely, that he'd been born 3 years after the commotion in Devonshire. And finally, a neighbour, Alice Weevil, testified that her own son had also been born after the commotion. And a similar mental habit of measuring time past against the date of the Western Rising was evident in the testimonies of a number of other witnesses in local legal cases. In 1594, for example, John Richards of Crantock in Cornwall deposed that he had lived in that neighbourhood ever since the commotion time, 40 years ago. While in 1602, Richard Clanborough, a yeoman from Lustley on the edge of Dartmoor, deposed that he had known the surrounding area ever since the commotion in the reign of King Edward VI. And testimonies like these hint that ordinary men and women in Devon and Cornwall may have recalled the Western Rising in particular as a crucial watershed in their lives, as an event of such magnitude that it split their own view of the past into the threefold division of time before, during and after the rebellion. Ordinary West Country folk, well, all West Country folk in fact, may well have remembered the Western Rising rather as our own grandparents and great-grandparents remembered the Second World War, and rather as we ourselves will probably remember the COVID-19 pandemic. The specific nomenclature which individual plebeians in the southwest chose to adopt when they were speaking of the revolts through which they had lived is also worth pausing to consider. We've already noted Tozer's reference to his own birth a year after Blackheath Field, and other local commoners also used this specific phrase in retrospect to denote the rising of May to June 1497. During the 1530s, for example, the townsmen of Bodmin complained that the prior of Bodmin's servants had threatened, that their master would see them hanged and wear nooses, as their predecessors did at Blackheath Field. Clear evidence of how the harsh punishments meted out in the wake of the rebellion had lingered in communal memory for decades to come. And that the First Cornish Rebellion of 1497 should have come to be popularly known by the shorthand title of Blackheath Field is not surprising, for the insurgency had moved swiftly outside the region itself, and the battle fought near London had certainly been its most dramatic and bloody episode. Little evidence has survived about how ordinary folk remembered Warbeck's rising, apart from in Exeter, and it's tempting to suggest that in most local communities, popular memories of this revolt may eventually have become conflated with those of the rebellion which had occurred earlier that same year. And a similar process of blurring may well have affected plebeian memories of the West Cornish rising of 1548. Now, we don't know that much about the way that this was looked back on, but we do know that at Launceston, the clerk of the Guild of All Hallows appears to have termed the 1548 rising the commotion time. Now, this was the name which had already been applied in 1536 to the great protest in the north against Henry VIII's religious policies, which is today known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. And this same phrase, commotion time, would eventually go on to be applied not just to the rebellion of 1549 in Devon and Cornwall, but also to the much wider series of rebellions which broke out across much of England during that same year. Little evidence survives of West Cornish folk drawing a clear distinction between the revolts of 1548 and 1549 in their reminiscences, so it may well be that through the prism of memory, they eventually came to regard both those protests as having been comprised within a single commotion time. Now, the unanimity with which local plebeians insisted on referring to the Western Rising in retrospect as either the commotion time, the late commotion, or simply the commotion is striking. It seems probable that they chose to employ the word commotion simply because, unlike the word rebellion, it's a conveniently neutral term, one that has the merit of acknowledging civil strife without apportioning the blame to any particular party. And in the divided communities of the post-1549 Southwest, this would obviously have made routine social intercourse a good deal less fraught than would otherwise have been the case. Yet, at the same time, when we consider the care which official sources took to apply much more condemnatory names to the rising, and when we recall the objections of Westcott's imaginary gentleman critic, it's hard not to suspect that some local plebeians may have decided to adopt this particular form of nomenclature as a subtle act of resistance. The fact that there is no evidence of local people subsequently referring to the rising as the Rebellion of Commonwealth, the alternative name which was sometimes used by plebeian deponents in the southeast to describe the protests which had taken place there in 1549, is also worth noting. This tends to suggest that Devon and Cornish folk did not remember socio-economic grievances, issues of Commonwealth, as having been central to the Western Rising, as they had been to Kett's rebellion. On the other hand, the one overtly subversive comment which is known to have been made about the Western Rising in retrospect by a local commoner, the claim of an Exeter tailor made in 1560 that he had heard diverse persons report that a new Underhill would rise up amongst them again, does appear to have had a specifically economic application and to have related to a complex struggle which was then raging in Exeter over local trading rights. And this is a case which I'd like to explore in detail in another paper. Returning, though, to this question of nomenclature, I've so far discovered only a single instance of the word commotion being retrospectively paired with another word indicative of the rebels' purpose by a local individual looking back on the Western Rising. In a pamphlet published in 1584, John Hooker referred to the protest as the commotion for religion. Now, this appellation may well have been one that he'd invented himself, of course, and as Hooker was a gentleman, it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about how ordinary people remembered the rebellion. It does seem rather curious, however, that Hooker, a zealous Protestant, should have conferred a title which on the surface of things has a positive ring to it, evoking as it does a sense of genuine and uncomplicated religiosity. It seems a bit odd that he should have given this term to a protest of which he so heartily disapproved. A scornful reference to the commotion for popery, one cannot help but feel, would have been much more in Hooker's line. So it seems at least conceivable, therefore, that at this point in his text, Hooker had absent-mindedly reached for a name for the rebellion which had been in general circulation amongst the local populace at the time, a name which neatly encapsulated the essence of the revolt, and which, for obvious reasons, local people would have preferred to shorten simply to the commotion in their dealings with authority figures during the Edwardian and Elizabethan periods. And if this was indeed the case, then we can perhaps see a hint of lingering popular attachment to the rebel cause here, an attachment which had been made all but explicit in the predictions that a new Underhill would shortly arise, which had been made in 1560. How powerful was that sense of attachment to the old rebel cause, and for how long did it persist? McCulloch has persuasively argued that when the common folk of East Anglia rose up in support of Mary Tudor and against Lady Jane Grey in 1553, they were acting at least in part out of a desire for revenge against John Dudley, Jane's puppeteer and the leader of the Royal Army which had slaughtered Kett's followers at Dussindale 4 years before. Nor can we reasonably doubt that when the common folk of Devon pointedly ignored Sir Peter Carew's summons to rise against Mary in 1554, but rallied to her banner instead, they too were taking their revenge upon a man who had incurred widespread popular hatred as a result of his violent and repressive actions in 1549. Indeed, Carew's abortive revolt may almost be said to present a distorted reflection of the Western Rising, with a small band of former loyalists now turning rebel, and the local community as a whole coming out in support of the Crown. Though at this time, the town masters of Exeter, displaying a keen sense of self-preservation as always, chose to jump with the stronger side. Following the death of Mary, the accession of Elizabeth, and the gradual transformation of Devon and Cornwall into Protestant country over the next half-century, popular affection for the specific religious cause in whose defence the rebels had fought surely drained away. Yet a sense of pride in the valour with which they had fought clearly endured in plebeian memory until well into the early Stuart period. And turning finally once again to the subject of the Western Rising in the manuscript which he wrote during the 1620s, and this time speaking more directly of the ordinary men who had taken part in it, Thomas Westcott assured his genteel readers that if I should relate what hath been vulgarly reported of the strength and force and resolution of these commoners, you might peradventure take it with some doubt, lest it increased by time or penning. But such scepticism would be altogether, Westcott went on to insist, for I intend to gather no more harvest than comes from the seed of truth. And here we catch a precious glimpse of how the protesters of 1549 had still been remembered in vulgar report, that's to say, in the common voice of the countryside, some 70 years on. A glimpse which makes it clear that even after the specific motives which had prompted them to take up arms in the first place had been all but forgotten, a sense of proprietorial pride in their strength, force and resolution had lived on amongst the ordinary men and women who were their descendants. It seems a fitting epitaph to the commotioners of the Tudor Southwest and a fitting note on which to bring my lecture this evening to an end. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
And, yeah, lovely. I've got lots of questions for myself. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to open the floor to questions. We've got about 20 minutes or so. So, who would like to go first? If you pop your hand up, we'll run the mic over to you.
Thanks, Mark. That was terrific. Just as that final slide indicates, the Cornish language plays quite an important role here. And I wonder if you could say how you think that helped to perpetuate memories of this and official reactions to the prevalence of the Cornish language.
Yeah, I mean, a whole raft of really interesting issues there. I'll sort of try and answer them quickly, I suppose. The first thing, I've said already, it's really hard to get, well, as you know better than anyone, to get at the memories of ordinary people. And when I've been looking at this topic, I've actually found quite a lot in gentry writings and official writings, really hard to get at the memories of the common folk, even harder to get to memories of ordinary women, almost impossible to get at the memories of Cornish speakers, because of course, for those of you who's not sort of well up on Cornish language in the Tudor period, by the beginning of the Tudor period, the Cornish language was restricted to the western half of Cornwall, but it was beginning to recede quite quickly. By the end of the early modern period, it had almost vanished. The last speakers died in the early 1700s. So the Cornish language was already receding. Most of those who spoke it still were ordinary people. Most gentlemen had begun to abandon it altogether or just to speak it as a sort of sub-language. And so I have found virtually no memories at all of rebellion by Cornish speakers. And I have to admit that's a huge gap in my research. I'm not sure if anyone's ever going to be able to fill that gap, but it would be lovely to know how Cornish speakers had remembered these rebellions. There are a few hints, tantalising fragments, not very much. So I can't fill in much detail on that. What I can talk a bit more is sort of official reactions and what the consequences of all this were. So, as those of you who studied the Western Rising will know, in 1549, the Cornish and the Devonians were protesting against the new prayer book in English, and they were really requesting the return of the old Latin liturgy, the service in Latin. But at one point during the rebellion, the central government came to believe that the Cornish rebels had actually asked for a liturgy in their own tongue, for a Cornish prayer book. Now, we can't be absolutely certain that they did. They may have done, they may not. But I think a really unfortunate consequence of this is that the Cornish language becomes kind of tainted in the government's mind with rebellion. And so the awful consequence of the Cornish Rising of 1549, which in some ways is sort of designed to protect their own culture, they say at one point, we will not have this new service because many of us Cornish men speak no English. But again, that kind of makes the government feel, well, they're even more determined to sort of crush the Cornish. So the irony of this is, because the Cornish actually rose up in 1549 in defence of their religion and partly in defence of their own culture, the government refuses to give them any sort of new prayer book or liturgy in Cornish. The Welsh, on the other hand, who remain sort of passive, acquiescent throughout the Tudor period, they are eventually gifted a Welsh Bible and a Welsh prayer book. And I think those two contrasts help to explain why Welsh still survives and thrives today, whereas the Cornish language and the culture associated with it has sort of disappeared, the traditional Cornishness. Now, lots of scholars say, well, the Cornish language is in rapid decline anyway. It might have disappeared even without these rebellions, but I don't think there's much doubt that they hastened its decline, because it makes sort of Cornish ethnicity a kind of stigmatised identity, and it also makes the local gentry, I think, even keener to abandon it. So it has huge consequences, actually, in sort of cultural terms. But yeah, that's a really interesting question, Mark, and I've been fascinated by that for years. Thank you.
The question back here.
Yes. Right.
Thanks very much. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what Catholics make of all of this. Because you mentioned John Fox, for instance,
Yes.
and obviously, you know, a lot of the people you're writing about are as you made very clear, are writing from a, broadly speaking, Protestant loyalist
Absolutely.
perspective. But it strikes me that there's a lot that in the post-Reformation public sphere, a lot of mileage that could be made from this event by, you know, Catholic writers,
Yeah.
not necessarily operating in England, but maybe in other parts of Europe.
Yes.
So I just wondered if there is a kind of, you could say a little bit more about the kind of confessional background to a lot of the the sort of text that you're talking about, and if there's a kind of alternative Catholic narrative that could be constructed.
There is, absolutely. You know, when I put the talk together, I was thinking, you know, which sort of strands to concentrate on. So I focused, if you like, on the dominant stream of memory a lot of the time. But there is, you know, as Mark said, there's a Cornish stream, a sort of Cornish ethnic stream, which is very hard to get at but different. But you're absolutely right, there is a Catholic strand to this as well. What complicates things a little, of course, is though that those who rose in 1549 were rebels. They'd always been described as rebels. They were treated as rebels. So when Mary comes to the throne in 1554, she can't openly embrace them because they're rebels. So there is no sort of sudden turnaround that, you know, these people are fated by the Marian government, but there's no doubt that when Mary comes back to the throne, there's immense pleasure and excitement in the far southwest. I mean, Eamon Duffy's book has shown brilliantly how Morbarth reacts to this, or at least how, the parish priest there does. Somebody says at the time that the Cornish are joyful for Mary's restoration, and you can see why. And there are indeed, as you say, writers operating during the Elizabethan period on the continent who are sort of Catholic exiles who are presenting very much the opposite perspective on this. And there's a really good example, actually. One of the rebel leaders was a Cornishman named Winslade, and his son actually escapes to the continent and sort of gets swept up in various sort of Spanish plans to invade England during the 1580s and 90s. And Cheryl Hayden, who's an Australian scholar, very, very interested in the rebellion, she's actually followed up on an account which Winslade wrote in the 1580s, parts of which actually refer to the Western Rising, and it's very much from the opposite perspective, as you'd expect, talking about, you know, how the good Christian men of the Southwest had risen up and how they were opposed by a heap of heretics and these mercenary forces who were brought in to suppress them. And of course, it's a very bitter, anguished account. I mean, this is something, in fact, I didn't say in my talk, but the reason the government actually prevails in the end, it's completely unable to raise troops in the far southwest to put the Western Rising down. The only reason the government forces prevail is because they bring in large forces of mercenary troops who, fortuitously enough, were in London on their way to fight the Scots. And if these dogs of war hadn't been unleashed on the Western rebels, I suspect they might even have triumphed. I mean, there were huge numbers of people, as you say, sort of Catholic loyalists in sort of Hampshire, Wiltshire, who were waiting for them to advance. Winslade actually claims that the Welsh had sent envoys to the Western rebels and were offering to meet them on Salisbury Plain if they got that far. It obviously never happened, but you're absolutely right. There's a counter-narrative, but it's very much a suppressed narrative. I mean, it's hard to get any ordinary memories of the rebellion, and I don't think I've come across any ordinary Catholic memories. They tend to come from gentry and priests. But yeah, absolutely. I think you could have probably a whole talk on that subject, in fact. You know, it's a really interesting angle.
Thank you very much for the talk, and also for saying something just now which has slightly set my question up. You mentioned the mercenaries off to fight the Scots.
Yeah.
Does the international situation ever play into this, particularly in elite memories? Because obviously that's one of the things the government says in response, you know, kind of, you wicked, naughty people, you do wicked, naughty things. If you want to fight in Scotland.
Yes.
So how far does that fit into the narrative?
Well, absolutely. There are sort of two counter-narratives here really going on that, you know, as you say, absolutely. The government line is, you wicked people, you know, here we are fighting for England against the Scots and you're sort of stabbing us in the back. So, as you say, they say, well, you're aiding the Scots. And they also say, and also it's very likely that you'd be aiding the French, because at this time, very unwisely, Protector Somerset is limbering up to fight the French as well as the Scots. So there is very much on the government's point of view a desire to present the Western rebels as traitors. But in some of their own writings, they twist this around. And to be honest, more accurately, they say, well, you are unleashing foreign mercenaries on your own people, and there is a field of blood already in Oxfordshire where the Oxford rebels, who actually had a very similar view to the Western rebels, they were the first group to be completely destroyed by Somerset's mercenaries, and a force of Germans, Burgundians and Italians was unleashed on the Oxford people, who were cut to pieces in really, really bloody and unpleasant fighting, and then those same soldiers are sent into the southwest. So there's a huge sense of grievance against that as well, and the government itself admits, so turning the story back a little bit, Lord Russell, who is the leader of the government forces in the West, he's a sort of a beleaguered general because he's got less than 1,000 men, and as I've said already, he cannot get local men to rally to him. He writes to the government saying, you know, for goodness sake, get these foreign mercenaries to me quickly. And they say, well, we'd like to, but they create so much hostility wherever they go that it's actually very difficult to find anywhere to quarter them. So I think the Western rebels are also appealing in a way to a sense of xenophobia against these foreign mercenaries that the government's brought into England. And I mean, throughout the early modern period, the greatest fear of true-born English men and women is that foreign soldiers were brought into the country. That's what Somerset's government's done. And the fact that he uses those troops to absolutely annihilate these rebels and to kill so many of them, that left a terrible strain, I think, a stain on his reputation. But yeah, there is a whole international angle to this. And again, I've mentioned Cheryl already. Cheryl is actually currently working on a very interesting document which seems to be originally a set of demands written by the Western rebels, which is spirited away after their defeat, is taken into Scotland and then into France, and is reworked in both of those places, really to suit the agenda of the French. So there's a really interesting story going on there, and Cheryl has just written an article on this, which I hope may be published soon. But you're right, that's her particular interest, is this foreign dimension to what's going on here. Thank you.
Time for one or two more questions.
Thank you very much. I'm curious about later sort of cultural memory. Obviously, on the slide, there's something from 1966, but as a local yourself, I'm really curious about your own cultural memory or lack thereof, or when you were growing up.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm a bit unusual because I've always been sort of 16th century, 17th century nerd. So I can't pretend all of my schoolmates were incredibly committed to these things. But what I would say is, I mean, I grew up not far from Exeter. Exeter was our home city. It's the capital of the West Country, you know, it's proud Queen of the West. And this motto, Semper Fidelis, it is everywhere. The local football team, Exeter City, it's actually on their badge. So, you know, when I was at school, all of the kids with the football shirts would have Semper Fidelis on their fronts. It's above the Guildhall in the city. There's a massive Semper Fidelis and City Arms sign outside the football ground. So I think certainly all boys, at least, who are interested in football are aware of that really from a very young age, and everyone who grows up in the city is aware of it, but no one's really quite sure where it came from, and it's usually said it's because Exeter was very royalist in the Civil War, but another piece that I'm working on at the moment is actually saying that I think it's all about 1549, but you know, I won't go into that subject in too much depth. So I think locally, the real memory that was sort of current was this idea of Exeter as a loyal city. But going back to Mark's point, I think what's very interesting is how alive these issues are still in Cornwall, and that's where they're still really present and contested. I think ever since, well, the late 1600s, Cornish writers have been tapping into the Cornish rebellions as a sort of an emblem of the way that the Cornish have resisted being incorporated into England, and as a sign of Cornish pride and Cornish sort of orneriness and desire to pursue a different path. I mean, that was very evident in 1997, which was that was, gosh, let me say, I'm not very good at maths, but I think, yes, 400 years or 500 years since the rising of 1497. A huge number of Cornish people actually marched to London in 1497 to protest against various local issues. This sign was put up by Mebyon Kernow, which is the Cornish Nationalist Party, in memory of Michael Joseph the Smith. So there's a Cornish nationalist strand to all of this. As Mark said as well, there's a Cornish culture strand to it, where it's, you know, very interesting in the defence of the language. There's a Cornish Catholic strand to this. There's a Cornish Roman Catholic church in St Ives, which has got a mural really honouring the Western rebels, which was put up in 1949 as sort of defenders of Cornishness and Roman Catholicism. And I couldn't really get this into the lecture, but very interesting for me. Last year, there was actually a play put on in Exeter by the Cornish playwright Sarah Dickinson, and it's simply called The Commotion Time. And it's a community play which is all about you know, the Western Rising, very much seen from a Cornish perspective. And what Sarah really did was take the story which Eamon Duffy told in The Voices of Morbarth, relocated that to a Cornish village, and sort of imagined what it would be like for the men and women in that parish to have lived through the Western Rebellion. I mentioned the question of gender, and Sarah's seen this very much from a gender perspective. It's the story of the women of the village above all else and how they coped with this assault on their culture. It was staged in Exeter on a number of occasions. I confess that I went 2 or 3 times. And I mean, it was an incredibly moving experience. There were huge numbers of people who come up from Cornwall to hear it. There were a number of Catholics who'd come to hear it. There were some sort of Catholic, curious Exeter people who'd come to see it as well. And, you know, there were people waving Cornish flags, and there was a sort of rousing sing-song about Cornishness at the end. And I mean, it really stirred the emotion. And obviously, as an Exeter man myself, I'm slightly on both sides. But I mean, I don't think there are many local history events which would actually stir up quite such a sense of feeling, apart from those relating to the First and Second World War. So yeah, I mean, it's a very live issue. And again, you know, I'd be tempted to write a whole talk on this, because there are a number of places now in the West Country where monuments have gone up over the last 50 years, and it's a kind of accelerating trend. So the West Country seems to be really taking ownership of these rebellions in a way that simply wasn't true before. And I think it's partly because we are living in an age when rebellion has become much more mainstream. Nobody wants to be seen as the establishment. Everybody wants to be seen as a rebel. And I think that's why the rebels of the past are suddenly being taken to people's hearts in the way that they weren't before. And Semper Fidelis doesn't have quite the same ring to it that it once had. But I mean, you raise a fascinating question there. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for one more quick question, if anybody. Yeah. Excellent.
Thanks for the lecture.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, you said there was a Cornish nationalist strand to this.
Yeah.
I found that quite interesting. So would you say that these rebellions have been like almost carried through like history as sort of symbol of Cornish independence and Cornishness, like generally?
Absolutely right. I mean, there's no doubt, since the rise of Mebion Kerno, which is the Cornish Nationalist Party, which is, you know, quite recent, I think it's back to the late 50s, early 60s, since then, all of the Cornish revolts have certainly been used by them for precisely that purpose, as a kind of banner to wave for Cornish difference. And obviously that's been politicised, and in my view, it's sometimes taken a bit too far. Some of the Cornish nationalists call 1549 the English-Cornish War, which, you know, it wasn't, and it sort of leaves Devon out of the equation, which leaves me slightly, you know, a bit miffed by that. But I think all the way through history, in fact, Cornish writers have done the same sort of thing. Right back in the 1670s, there was a Cornish writer called William Scorn, who was one of the first Cornish gentlemen who tried to preserve and protect the language. And intriguingly, he looked back to the rebellions of the 1490s in exactly the same way. Now, Scorn was an uber-royalist, and he'd fought for the royalists in the Civil War, and Cornwall was actually incredibly loyal to the king in the Civil War, but he saw that as part of a pattern of the Cornish being sort of better than the English. And he looked back to 1497, and although obviously because they were rebels, he couldn't really embrace them wholeheartedly, he couldn't help but sort of praise them in a way. He said, although they were rebels, they did a number of good things and this thing. So I think there's been all through Cornish history this pattern of looking back to these rebellions as a sign of Cornish independence, Cornish strength and Cornish valour, and it still operates in just that same way today. Perhaps that explains, you know, as you sort of hint, why this is still a live issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Before we put our hands together and thank Mark again, and then all wander off and wish that we were in Devon or Cornwall this lovely weekend.
Well, it's lovely to be here today.
Thank you. I'm just going to take 2 minutes of your time to let you know what we've got coming up next, which I need my reading glasses for, I'm afraid. So our next London-based lecture takes place on Wednesday, the 2nd of July, when we welcome Professor Peter Gattrell to give this year's Royal Historical Society Prothero Lecture, which is one of the highlights of the Society's year. As many of you will know, Peter is one of the UK's leading historians of modern migration, and his 2025 Prothero Lecture is entitled Refugee Worlds, a 20th Century Retrospective, and the lecture will be followed by the Society's annual summer party, to which you are all also very warmly invited. Very fittingly, our next actual event is away from London. Later this month, we are visiting historians at the Cornwall campus of the University of Exeter at Penryn, Falmouth. So that visit's going to be accompanied by a public event on Wednesday, the 21st of May, which is Professor Katrina Pennell, who works there, an excellent historian, and myself discussing the cultural memory and the 2 world wars in Britain. So if anybody is based down there and would like to come along, you'd be very, very welcome. It'd be lovely to see you. And online, of course, we continue our new Writing Well series, looking at the practice of good historical writing with a guide to scholarly editions and editing, which takes place online on the 26th of June. So full details and booking for all of these events, as well as lectures, workshops and panels held later in the year, are of course all available from the Royal Historical Society's website. So thank you for that. And I would like to close by just reiterating our thanks to Mark for a fantastic lecture.
Thank you,
Mark.
Thank you all. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much.